So, thinking about this, first of all, what is critical analysis? I'm sure you've heard your tutors talk about this in many, many different contexts, but I think the first thing to say is it really begins with a critical mindset. It begins with a mindset which is a sort of a healthy skepticism towards the information that you found in the sources. It's about not automatically accepting everything the sources say. It's about sort of having a default mindset that questions and probes the sources, that asks, yes, but are you sure about that? And where did you get that from? Basically asking to see the receipts when you read a journal article or a book or whatever, thinking, where did this come from? How did you get there? Why did you make that connection? Asking to see the writer's receipts, basically having that healthy skepticism towards what they're telling you. In terms of how that translates into actual critical analysis, well, critical analysis is about actively assessing and evaluating the information you find in the sources, thinking about, for example, the quality of that information, how reliable is it? Or thinking about the suitability of that information, how relevant or useful is it to you for your purposes on whatever task you are working on at that time. And what you're aiming for is a fair, balanced assessment of the sources. The good and the bad. You can see here I've got the positive and the negative symbol, so it's about a fair and balanced assessment of the good and the less good aspects of these sources. And once you have that fair and balanced assessment of what you've read, you can start to think how you can use that assessment to build your own answer to the question, because that's what you're being asked to do most of the time, is to give your own response, your own individual response to a task. It's important to say what critical analysis is not, because I think the word critical can be quite misleading. It does not just mean being, overly and relentlessly cynical about other people's work. It does not only mean focusing on fault finding and kind of picking holes in other writers' work. That is part of it, but it is far from being the only part. Okay, so if you only dwell on the weaknesses, the flaws, the limitations of other writers' work, that is going to give a very unfair and unbalanced assessment of their work. What we're aiming for, as I said, is a fair and balanced assessment of what we read that includes the better and the worse aspects of it. So why is that so important? Why is this so vital that you show this in your work? Why is it something that your tutors, your lecturers are always talking about? Well, first of all, it matters because your lecturers expect you to do it. They expect you to apply critical analysis to your work, whatever your discipline. And that's how students get higher grades. And if you feel like you have maybe plateaued at a certain level of grades and you just don't know how you need to break through to those higher grade bands, perhaps critical analysis is one of the ways that you might break through to those higher grade bands. So it matters very much immediately for you as individual students. That's how you get better grades. That's how you give your tutors what they want to see. But more generally, if we don't critically analyze the sources, if we don't critically analyze what we read, we will just simply accept what they tell us by default, I guess. And there's a good chance that that will include some bad evidence, some flawed arguments. And the risk is that we then end up building our own views, our own kind of worldview, our own understanding of our subjects on shaky foundations. So critical analysis keeps us sharp individually and collectively. It develops our skills as individual scholars, but it also ensures that scholarship in our field, in our discipline, evolves, that it continues to develop and improve, that it doesn't become fossilized or compromised by bad information. So it really is essential. So if we want to think about how we can read more critically, because that's the first step, right? We need to read critically before we can actually demonstrate it and apply it in our own work. The first thing to talk about here is the fact that scholarship is not infallible. Even if something is published in the most eminent journals, even if the person who wrote it is a very, very kind of influential or key thinker in their field, the fact that it is published does not mean it is infallible. It probably means it is very good a lot of the time because it's been through a process of peer review, but that does not mean there may not be limitations or problems with it sometimes. Okay, so an example of that is the fact that it may have been influenced by a writer's personal outlooks and agendas, particularly if you are studying something like an arts and humanities subject. Many of the writers you read will have personal sort of ways of looking at the world and interpreting the world. They may have certain kind of allegiances. For example, they might be a Marxist scholar or something like that. They have certain ways of interpreting the world, and that will affect what they read. Or they may have certain kind of agendas or priorities that affect the way that they have interpreted and presented information. It may have been influenced by the context it was written in. Every text is a product of not just an individual writer's mind, but also a time and a place. What was happening in that time at that place when it was written that might have affected the kind of messages, the kind of spin, if you like, that this text put on things. Writers may have used unsound evidence. Very rarely that will be deliberate, but writers are human. They make mistakes. They may have used unsound evidence or evidence that they thought was sound at the time, that everyone thought was sound at the time, but now, after the passage of a few years, we realize that evidence wasn't so great. Or they may have used unsound methods. Again, those methods might have been fine at the time, but scholarship may have evolved, and we now may realize that those methods had problems. Scholars' arguments may be flawed. They may have interpreted the data or the information in ways that you think just don't quite stack up, or there is a failure of logic there, or they may have misunderstood something, in your opinion, or they may have missed something important. There may be crucial information that either they missed through oversight, or it just wasn't available to them at the time of writing. And this takes us on to the final point, really, that scholarship is a living thing. It's always in motion. It's always evolving. And as it continues to evolve, inevitably older ideas may be superseded. Okay, so it's not necessarily that texts had a problem at the time always. It's just that as the years have passed, we now realize that there may be problems with. It may sound very obvious, but what we often see in the academic skills team, in our interactions with students and in our teaching, is that students realize that scholarship is not completely infallible. That does not translate so much into their own work. That awareness is kind of, it's sort of a passive awareness that does not actively translate into their own work enough. Okay, so what does this mean if scholarship is not infallible? Well, it should change our relationship with that scholarship. It means that we should approach that scholarship critically. We should not automatically and always, in all circumstances, just accept everything we read without probing it, without challenging it, without questioning it. Basically, when we interact with scholarship by reading journal articles, books, whatever, we should try to make that as much of a dialogue as we can, not a monologue. So rather than just sort of allowing the sources to talk to us one way as a monologue, we should try to kind of talk back to the text a bit. I know that might sound odd, the idea of kind of talking back to a book or a journal article, but there are ways that we can do that. I'm going to talk about those later in the session. There are ways that we can, in a strange way, kind of enter into a dialogue with the sources and into a dialogue with the authors, even in a position of just sitting in a library reading silently. Okay, and if we do that, we are on a much better path to demonstrating criticality in our own work. So one of the most obvious and straightforward ways that we can do that to start that dialogue with the sources is to ask the writer questions. Now, of course, we can't do that in real life most of the time, but we can imagine that as we read, the writer is speaking to us, and we can imagine that we are asking them questions back. So we can imagine asking them things like, why have you made that connection? Why did you say that? How does that work? How does that idea work? How does that model work? Why did you do it this way rather than that way? Or, you know, what does it mean when you say that? How do you know that? Maybe you can think, yes, that's fine, but what about this other thing? There's many questions, far more questions than we've got here. This is just a sample, but it's to show you that idea of how we can start to imagine that we are talking back to the text, talking back to the writer, and asking them questions to start moving in a more critical direction. And if we do that as we are reading, if we imagine asking the writer questions, the next kind of knock-on effect of that is that we should think about how we are taking notes when we read. So when you take notes, many students, and I did this myself in my undergraduate degree, you just record what the sources say. So, you know, you write down the name of the book, the author, perhaps the page numbers, and you kind of diligently read through and you just record what the sources say. The problem with that is that although it's a very good record of what that source says, it kind of implies that everything the source says is reliable or accurate or can be completely trusted. And if we have any doubts or questions or reservations about those sources, then if we don't make a note of those doubts or questions or reservations, then we're far less likely to remember them. There's a danger that they will kind of evaporate and they're just gone. And that's a real shame, because those doubts, those questions, those reservations are kind of critical gold. Okay, they can be extremely valuable and useful to us. So don't only record what the sources say. You need to do that, of course. You need to record what the sources say, the key points, but very importantly, you also need to record your own responses to what the sources say. For example, what seems particularly persuasive to you? What do you think is an especially good argument? Or what do you think is an especially good, compelling bit of evidence, and why? On the other hand, what do you find less convincing? Do you think there is an argument that is a bit weaker? Do you think there is some evidence that is a bit less compelling, and why? Another kind of question you could think of is, how does this source relate to the other texts about this topic that you've read? Because they're all connected. All these scholars read each other's work. So what are the kind of relationships between the texts? Another question, what kind of implications does this evidence or these arguments have? So again, many different ways that you could record your responses. It might be ideas, it might be thoughts, it might be questions, it might be feelings if you read something particularly surprising. Many different ways that you can respond to texts. The really important thing is that you record those responses, that you keep a record of your thinking about the sources as well as what the sources are saying. So you're kind of, rather than just taking notes on one thing, what the sources say, you're simultaneously taking notes on two different things, what the sources say, and then your response to what the sources are saying. Having these kind of critical questions, these kind of critical thoughts, if you're not used to doing that already, it might feel a bit strange at first. It might feel odd to be recording your own responses to information as well as the information itself. But the more you do it, the more instinctive and easier it will get. And you can use prompts to try to stimulate those critical questions. So, for example, some of you may have heard of the PNI model, if you like. For any, I mean, this is a very basic one, but for any source that you've interacted with, can you find something positive to say about it? That's the P, right? Can you discuss a strength of this source? Is there a particularly useful bit of data? Is there a particularly compelling argument? Is there a particularly kind of original take on something? On the other hand, can you think of something that is negative about this source? Can you demonstrate a limitation or a weakness of this source? And is there something that is just kind of, it's neither particularly positive or negative, it's interesting, it's perhaps unusual or original about this source? And that's, as I said, a very basic model, but it's a way that you can start thinking about the sources more critically and ensuring that you are going beyond just describing them, that you're actually sort of thinking about their strengths and their weaknesses and what is distinctive about them. It's always good to start with the positives before moving on to the negatives. But there are more sophisticated ways that you can do this as well. So, for example, we can think about talking back to the text. What you can see on your screen here is in the dark text, you know, an excerpt from a journal article or a book, whatever. And in the red, you can see how this student is talking back to it and talking back to specific parts of the text. So you can see here, linking to a highly contested arena, the student saying, well, why? What are the contentious points? And there's a note to themselves, you know, read up on this. And they've made another critical point here. They're saying it should help students to think well. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to think well? This student has said, well, they don't define it. And that is a potential weakness, right? That this writer is using a very important term in this context, but they're not defining it. And this student's saying, well, you know, remember to compare this with Phillips's definition. They've left a note to themselves. Lots and lots of notes to themselves, partly things to do, like read up on this, compare this definition, or compare this with Phillips's definition, think about how this student might use this in the future, so things that they should do, but also things that they should just remember, or ways that this text disagrees with another text, for example. This is one way that you can do it. If you like to mark up original texts like this, it can be a very, very effective way of starting to build up a bank of critical thinking. Another way that you can do it is the so-called Cornell style notes. Some of you may have seen this before, or the idea of split page notes. It's not terribly clear, I'm afraid, on this image, but I will show you at the end some links to resources where you can find out more about this. But essentially, this is about splitting your note-taking page or screen, whatever, into two parts. So on the right, you have the kind of notes from the text that most people tend to kind of make by default, right? This is what the text says, or the key points of what the text says. But on the left, this student is doing that very important critical stage of recording their own responses, their own thinking. So they are keeping a really, really useful record, not just of what the text says, but how they have interacted with it. And they are kind of catching these thoughts, these responses as they fly, rather than just kind of thinking them and then they've evaporated. Again, this is going to be a really, really useful resource for this student when they come to write up their assignment. If, as I said, you're not used to reading and thinking in this way, if you find this idea of recording your own responses to texts a bit strange, or if you just think, I wouldn't know the kind of questions to ask, I wouldn't know what are the right kind of critical questions to ask, well, you can use prompts to stimulate criticality, okay? And I'm going to show you, you can follow this link when you get the slides afterwards, but at the end of the session, I will show you where you can find those prompts that will help to kind of point you in the right kind of direction that will stimulate those critical questions. But the whole point of making notes like this, of doing this, of recording your own responses to the text as well as what the texts say, is that it deepens your engagement with the text. It's a much more active engagement with the text, because if you're just sitting there writing down what the texts say, that's relatively passive, okay? But if you are engaging with the text like this in a much more active way, sort of questioning things, challenging things, sort of having a debate within your own mind about how useful or how reliable something is, and keeping a record of it, that is going to be so useful to you when you come to write your assignment, because, as I said, you're going to have that bank of critical points all ready to go in your notes. So we've thought there about how you can read more critically, how you can use prompts to start thinking about the texts more critically, like P&I positive. Can you say something positive? Can you say a strength of this source? Can you discuss a negative, a limitation, a weakness of this source? Can you say something that is interesting about it? Or you can use prompts like this on the slides, but if I just scroll down, there's lots of critical questions here in different categories that you can use. Where's it from? Questions about the context, like where's it published, who published it, is there likely to be any potential bias, like corporate sponsorship? Questions about what's there overtly, what else is there, what kind of implications might there be, or allusions, that kind of thing, what's not there, and your own responses to it. So this is just one resource that you can use to help stimulate your critical thinking. But if I go back to the slides, hopefully by this point you've been, you know, if you've implemented this advice in the future, you will have been reading more critically, and you will have been taking more critical notes that record your own responses to what you're reading as well as what the texts say. And you will have that bank of critical points ready to use. So the next stage is how you can use them, how you can write more critically, how you can demonstrate that greater criticality to your lecturers. The first point is to put your critical notes to work. Now that you've got this bank of much more detailed critical points in your notes, that's going to give you plenty of ideas that you can turn into critical analysis in your assignment to impress your lecturer and to get higher grades. So explaining what you mean rather than implying it. And what I mean by that is, I read a lot of students' work, and very often I can be fairly confident that the student is implying something. They are implying a point, but they haven't said it explicitly. They haven't explained it step by step. And because of that, there is an ambiguity. I cannot be absolutely sure that that is what the student means. I am fairly confident, but I can't be sure. And unfortunately, lecturers can't give you marks for what they think you might mean. They can't give you marks when there is ambiguity there for implications. So it's really important that you explain step by step what you mean. So imagine that you are your tutor, and remember that they will read your assignments critically. They will be acting as critical readers towards your work. So it's really important that you avoid any ambiguity, and you guide your lecturers through your analysis step by step. And that really just means explaining very clearly what you mean. So we have an example here from the kind of thing that I see in students' work relatively often. Implications: this piece of evidence has been misunderstood, or this argument is not persuasive. Why or how has it been misunderstood? Saying it's been misunderstood is not really critical enough. It's kind of halfway there, but unless the student says how or why it's been misunderstood, they're not going to get the highest marks for criticality there. Again, this argument is not persuasive. Well, why is it not persuasive? In what ways is it not persuasive? And unfortunately for this student, they've only kind of gone halfway there. They haven't explained step by step in a critically analytical way why or in what ways this argument is not persuasive. On the other hand, if they'd really explained it, they would have got better marks. If they'd said this piece of evidence has been misunderstood because blah, 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 and set it out very clearly, or this argument is not persuasive because da, 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 that's what is going to impress your tutor. That is demonstrating critical analysis. You're telling the reader your evaluation of the text, your assessment of it, and explaining it step by step. There's a fine balance to be struck in your writing between describing enough, doing the level of description that you need, giving the level of description of sources that you need, but not describing too much. You do need some description of what the sources say. You do need to characterize or paraphrase or summarize what other writers have said, because you need to set the scene for the reader, right? If you didn't have some description of what the sources say, your critical analysis would make no sense. You need this to set the scene for the reader. But what we often see in students' work is that description sort of snowballs. It becomes too much, so it goes on too long. It stops being concise. It becomes a bit long-winded, a bit waffly. And because of that, it stops being relevant. It's almost like students sometimes end up describing things because they've kind of forgotten that the description is no longer relevant, describing things for the sake of things. And that can be very tempting if you think you've got to hit this word count, describe it a bit more and use up another 50 words or whatever. But resist that temptation, okay? Just keep your description of other writers' ideas relevant and concise, because it should only be there as a springboard for your critical analysis. It should only be as much description as you need so that your critical analysis makes sense. It's to set the scene. So, for example, if you only describe what another writer says, well, McLean 2003 argues blah, 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 or Jones 2017 states blah, 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 blah. This is the kind of thing we see very often in students' work. And unfortunately, a critical reader is going to read that and think, well, so what? Your lecturer probably already knows what the key sources in this field have said. And if they don't already know it, they could easily get this information by reading the sources for themselves. So there's no kind of added critical value there. Most importantly, it doesn't say what you think about what these sources have said. What you need to do is to go beyond description to critical analysis. For example, McLean 2003 argues X. However, this argument seems to underestimate the importance of Y. Or Jones 2017 states Y. This insight is particularly important because it has implications for Z. What's so good about this, why this is impressive critical analysis, is because your readers could not get this information anywhere else. They can't get this information by reading the sources for themselves, and they can't get it by reading any other student's essays because it's unique to you. It's personal to you. It tells the reader what you individually think about what the sources say. And notice as well that it's not just being negative. It's not that kind of relentlessly negative fault finding that we talked about earlier. Yes, this student is pointing out a limitation, a weakness in a source, saying this argument seems to underestimate the importance of something else, but they are also pointing to the strengths of these sources. They are giving the writers credit for, good insights, compelling arguments, that kind of thing. This insight is particularly important because it has implications for Z. So what they're doing here is giving the minimum of concise description of what these writers have said, keeping it concise and relevant, but it's pretty tight. It's concise, it's relevant, and it's just there as a springboard for the critical analysis, because this is what is going to get you marks, the critical analysis, not the description of what other writers have said. It's the critical analysis, the next step, that is going to get you the higher marks. And unfortunately, this is what so many students don't know or forget how to do. They give the description of other writers' ideas, but, you know, so what? It's not critical analysis. They don't use that as a springboard for that next step of saying why that is particularly good or why that is not so good. Why is it important? What are the implications of this? How does it relate to other texts? That kind of thing. That's what you need to try to do. And if you're not sure whether you are being critical enough, whether you are demonstrating critical analysis enough, well, ask yourself this key question as you look back through your drafts of your work. Could the reader have got this information just by reading the original source without reading your assignment? Could they have got this for themselves by reading the journal article or the book, whatever, without reading your assignment? If the answer is yes, then you're not critically analyzing it enough yet. But if you think, no, they couldn't have got this information by just reading the sources, because there is kind of added value there. There is an extra bit of criticality. You have kind of used it as a springboard, then yes, you are critically analyzing the text. Obviously, when you discuss the sources that you've read, and you give brief, concise descriptions of their positions, their stances, their arguments, whatever, you have two basic choices about how you do that. And the first is that you can quote from them. You can quote them word for word. Another common problem that students have that kind of pulls down their criticality mark is that they quote too much. There are just too many quotations, or the quotations are too long. So it's really important that you just quote sparingly. It's a bit like putting salt on food. A little bit is fine, but it's very easy to overdo it. Only quote when you really need to, because you can't paraphrase the original wording without losing something really, really essential, like the aesthetic beauty of it, or the aesthetic qualities if it's poetry, or the subtleties of meaning if it's, for example, a definition from a legal document. Only quote when you cannot paraphrase it without losing something genuinely essential from the original. But when you do quote, never just quote, never just kind of plonk a quote in and then move on. If you are going to quote, and it is good to quote sometimes, but if you are going to do it, make sure that you always do something with that quote, analyze it, talk about it. Don't just put the quote there and move on as if it speaks for itself, because it doesn't. If you just put a quote there and you don't say anything else about it, again, there's no critical analysis. It doesn't speak for itself. Anybody could do that in any essay. Your tutor wants to see how you have responded to that quote, what you make of it. Make sure that you go that extra step. Use the quote again as a springboard to say something interesting or useful about that quote, something critical. An example of that, of quoting sparingly when you really need to, is in this paragraph. I will just give you a second to read through this on the screen. Paragraph from an essay about students studying foreign languages. So hopefully you've had a chance to read through that. And what we've got here is a real quotation, right? This isn't a paraphrase. This is a genuine quotation in quotation marks You can see the name of the author, Scott, the date of publication, and the page number, because this is referenced in the Harvard style. This is a good use of a quotation, I would say, because it's short and it's relevant, it's concise and it's relevant, and I think it would have been very difficult for the writer of this essay to paraphrase that insight without losing some of the original kind of power or evocative wording of the original. So I think this is an effective use of a quotation. However, notice that it is only one quotation in this main paragraph, and as I said, it is pretty concise. Most of the time, by default, what you should be doing when you talk about other writers' ideas is paraphrasing them, putting their ideas in your own words. And basically, you should do this unless there is a very good reason not to. Like, as we said, you simply cannot paraphrase without losing something essential from the original. There's various reasons why paraphrasing is better, but two of the most important ones is, firstly, it shows more understanding of the source to your tutor. If you just quote something, quoting something is pretty straightforward. You just lift it out of the original and plonk it in your own essay. If you paraphrase it, put it in your own words, that shows that you have really understood it. But perhaps even more importantly than that for this session is that when you paraphrase something, it creates additional opportunities to demonstrate criticality. And one of the ways you can do that is by using reporting verbs. These are verbs, you may not have heard of reporting verbs before, but these are, as the name suggests, verbs used to report what sources say. And the really important thing about these is there's many reporting verbs, but they all have kind of shades of meaning. And on a daily basis, we are exposed to reporting verbs in our everyday lives, and we're so used to them a lot of the time that we don't even get, the effect is subconscious. We don't even kind of really think about it. We just kind of absorb it by osmosis almost. But the important thing about these is that they tell the person who is reading or listening to this writer how that writer regards what the sources say in an appropriately academic way, in a subtle and kind of nuanced way, in a sort of a sufficiently kind of cool, academic, distant way. For example, the Prime Minister claimed to have no knowledge of this. Early results from laboratory studies suggest a connection between X and Y, or peer-reviewed data from numerous studies demonstrates that global temperatures are rising. All of these claimed, suggest, demonstrates are reporting verbs. But what if we say the Prime Minister claimed to have no knowledge of this? What is the implication of using the verb claim there? What does it kind of subtly tell the reader about how this writer regards what the Prime Minister said? This tells us as readers that this is that that the writer who wrote this is profoundly skeptical about this claim. They don't really buy it, to be honest. How about this one? Results from laboratory studies suggest a connection between X and Y. As it says here, early results from laboratory studies. If you say something suggests something, it's quite kind of tentative. It's quite cautious. On the other hand, if you say something is demonstrated, something demonstrates something, that is much stronger. That really tells the reader that you have much more confidence, that you are much kind of surer of this. As you can see here, peer-reviewed data from numerous studies, that gives us the context, that helps us to understand why this writer is so confident about what they're saying, about the accuracy of this data. So one way that you can subtly indicate your stance to your readers, that one way you can subtly show your tutors that you are being critical, is to use reporting verbs like this. And we can see an example of this in the in the main paragraph that we just looked at. Same main paragraph that we looked at a moment ago with the quotation here, but this time I've highlighted the reporting verbs here. So we can infer from this student's work that they don't really accept this claim from Henderson that not studying foreign languages doesn't disadvantage students. What they're doing here is just reporting what Henderson said, Henderson's kind of arguments or beliefs, but they are using reporting verbs to give their kind of take on it. They're not reporting it neutrally. They are saying, this is what Henderson says, but I don't really buy it, to be honest. On the other hand, this is what Jackson said in 2021, but because they're using the verb demonstrates, we get the strong impression that this writer, this student, regards Jackson's arguments as far more persuasive, far more compelling than Henderson's. But that's a start, right? That is a start towards critical analysis, but it's not enough on its own. It's not enough just to use reporting verbs. It's a good first step, but you need to go further. And one of the ways you can do that is with summary sentences, or sometimes called so what sentences, right? If you think, well, it's at the end of a main paragraph after you have evaluated the other sources' arguments, the evidence, etc. This is where you should tell the reader what your response to what these sources have said is, which is why it's sometimes called a so what sentence, right? Imagine somebody is reading your work and they get to the end of a paragraph and they think, well, so what, what do you think? This is where you need to summarize your response to what the sources have said and to tell the reader how this helps to answer the question. So if we look again at the same main paragraph, we can see that's what this student has done. They've used reporting verbs when they've been describing or paraphrasing other writers' ideas. So they've started to give us a sense of their own kind of position with these reporting verbs like claims, demonstrates. But much more powerfully than that, at the end of the main paragraph, when they've evaluated, they've considered these different kind of arguments, these different interpretations of the evidence, they've said to the reader very clearly, look, here's the critical analysis, right? It is clear that the idea of translation software filling the gap left by the decline in the study of foreign languages is reductive, right? They're basically saying Henderson's argument is reductive because it treats communication between cultures as transactional rather than transformational. This is a very clear and very powerfully, persuasively worded bit of critical analysis where this student is saying, I've thought about these other arguments, I've compared and contrasted them, but this is where my this is the side of the fence I come down on. This is my own understanding of the issue. This is my own response to what I have read. This is what I think. And saying it at the end of this main paragraph is particularly powerful because it neatly rounds off that main paragraph, and it's the last thing that readers remember. It's so that the last thing they remember from this paragraph is your voice, not the voice of other writers, your voice. If you, for example, if you watch the news this evening, look out for reporting verbs. Look out for the way that TV or radio news uses reporting verbs to describe what politicians have been up to or to describe scientific data. You will see that they are subtly doing this, that they are subtly indicating criticality by using reporting verbs. So I think these are what we're talking about is applicable across a wide range of media. We've talked about various tools, various strategies that you can implement as you are writing. We've talked about things like, what have we talked about? Making sure you explain exactly what you mean rather than implying it. So, asking yourself, have I made this clear enough? Trying to sort of deny your critical reader the opportunity to ask questions like, well, why do you say that? Why is that not persuasive? Making sure you're explaining yourself, because this, because that, give your reasons step by step. Keeping the description of other writers' ideas, the paraphrasing of other writers' ideas concise, and using it as a springboard to go beyond that, to demonstrate criticality. Making sure that you're giving the reader more than they could have got just by reading the sources for themselves. Using reporting verbs and paraphrasing other writers' ideas, and then crucially using powerful summary sentences at the end of your main paragraphs. But it's really important to note that you need to try to develop the ability to be your own critic. Okay, nobody produces their best work first time, and any good assignment or any good essay, to make it as good as it can be, will probably need to go through a couple of drafts, at least 2 drafts. And when you're doing that, when you're trying to be your own critic, to assess your own work critically, try, if you can, if you have time, try to put it down for a couple of days so that you come back to it with fresh eyes, and try to give it what we call a challenge read, right? Which is where we ask you to try to read it like your lecturer will, like a critical reader will. And what you're doing is looking for places where a critical reader could legitimately ask critical questions. You're trying to kind of preempt and deny your lecturer any opportunity to say, yeah, but you haven't explained this properly, or why did you say that, or why is this, you've said this is a compelling argument, why is it a compelling argument? You've said this evidence is flawed, why is it flawed? You haven't explained yourself enough. So try to beat your lecturer to it, basically. Have you only described other writers' ideas, or have you gone beyond that and actually critically analyzed them? Have you used them as a springboard rather than just plonking them in your essay? Have you implied what you mean, or have you really explained it step by step? We've raced through that, so I would just like to summarize it briefly before we talk about some additional resources, places where you can find out more. So, in summary, critical analysis starts with good reading. And by good reading, I mean reading that is healthily skeptical, right? Not overly cynical, not ruthlessly and relentlessly picking holes in other writers' work, but read with a healthy skepticism. And if you feel like you don't know where to start with critical reading, check out these prompts to encourage, to stimulate those kind of critical questions, to give you ideas of the kind of critical questions that you can start to ask of texts. Remember that we said, you know, better reading is more like a dialogue than a monologue with the sources, with the text. Imagine yourself talking to the writers and asking them questions. Why did you say that? Why did you interpret the evidence in that way? Haven't you forgotten about this? What about that? Try to think of those questions that you would ask the sources and note them down. Don't just let them evaporate. Record your own responses, your own questions, your own doubts, your own reservations about the sources, but also the things you think are really good, the things that you think are insightful, that are original, that are really persuasive. Then when it comes to writing your assignment, you will have all of those critical points there in your notes, and it will be very much easier then to go beyond just describing, just paraphrasing other writers' ideas. You will have all those critical insights ready to just bring in from your notes and include them in your assignments. But remember, when you talk about other writers' work, other sources, paraphrase them most of the time, but then go beyond that. Make sure you evaluate them. How useful are they? How persuasive are they? How applicable are they? How relevant are they? And explain to your readers your evaluation. Explain why you think the things you do. What is your reasoning for thinking that one argument is very persuasive and the other argument is not very persuasive? What is your reasoning for thinking this evidence is good, that evidence is not so good? This scientific study was carried out in a very rigorous way. This other one maybe it was good at the time, but things have moved on, and now we think that wasn't such a great way to do it. So explain your thinking to your readers. And the best way to improve that criticality, to make sure it's really kind of coming through strongly in your work, is write a draft, give it a challenge read, try to think like your lecturer, look for those weak spots, look for those places where you haven't explained yourself enough, or something is a bit ambiguous, or you haven't fully explained your thinking. Improve it, redraft it, refine it, and work it up into the best, most kind of rigorously critical version that it can be. If you want to find out more about this, and there is lots more to find out about this, this is just a taster really today. We've got lots of resources here. So we've got our strategic reading framework. That's where you can find many of the critical questions that you can use when you are reading a source. There's also this idea of 3 domains of critical reading, which is especially useful for people working on, for example, literature reviews for something like a dissertation. If you are having to think about a whole body of scholarship on a particular topic, this is a really good thing to have a look at. We've also got some advice here on how you can take more critical notes, different kind of note-taking techniques and strategies, and how you can integrate, how you can use scholarship in your work critically, using things like reporting verbs, but also, if you're not sure how to phrase being critical, there's this fantastic resource from Manchester University. I'll show you here. There's all different kinds of categories, but I've jumped to being critical. If you want to know how to, talk politely about the problems and limitations in another writer's theory or an argument, but you're not quite sure how, click on that. Loads and loads and loads of suggestions for the kind of language you can use to offer constructive criticism in an appropriately academic way. Okay. So lots and lots of resources there, which I hope will be helpful to you. We have loads and loads and loads of resources on our academic skills kit, which you can find by following this link. And please do consider coming to further your skills sessions in the future, and do leave us some feedback if you would like to.